So that was the view from Spain, and here to help me figure out why that's such a different view than the massive public opinion outcry that we hear about here in the United States is campaigner for progressive organization Roots Action, David Swanson. So thank you for being here. In Spain, we see people making this connection between a country that is broke and their involvement in a military campaign. How come at a time when all over, all you can hear about is the debt ceiling, the U.S. debt problem, people in the United States are not making this connection? The United States continues in Libya pretty much unchecked in the court of public opinion in that way.
Well, the short answer is U.S. corporate media is lousy, but, you know, the Congress is feeling some pressure against money for the war in Libya, and if we can work together with the people in Spain to push both our governments not to pay for it, that may be effective. But, you know, what's unique about the U.S. budget is not the health care and the Social Security and the debt, it's the war and the military. We just saw the House of Representatives pass a military budget bigger than ever before. We've almost doubled it, we've more than doubled it in the past 10 years, not counting Homeland Security and Energy and State and all the other departments. We have, I think, 25% of Americans in a poll this year think the United States should spend 3 times the next competing nation on military expenses each year. The United States spends about 7 times what China spends, not counting all those other departments. Nobody wants that. If you put a bill in Congress that said the United States can't spend more than 3 times the next competing nation on its military, everybody in the public would favor it, but it would get nowhere with this Congress, and it's not part of the discussion.
But let's talk about the discussion among American people, because you see a different connection being made in Spain. I've seen it on the streets in Portugal where people were protesting NATO, saying our country needs money. We don't want that money going to NATO. We don't want it going to the military. Here in the United States, you don't see that connection as often being made, even though the U.S. spends half of its discretionary spending on defense. My favorite clip is when a CNN anchor was, you know, very strongly correcting her guest, saying, hey, whoa, 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 we have debts and deficits in the U.S., they're humongous, but Libya, that's a totally separate thing. Why isn't there more of a connection by the masses here in the U.S.?
Well, one answer is that they never hear about it on the radio or the TV. I mean, you have a discussion that includes the right-wingers who want to talk about health care and Social Security, the sort of centrist think tankers who want to talk about the recession and the lack of revenue from the recession, and the progressive think tankers and economists who want to talk about the Bush tax cuts that we still call the Bush tax cuts. They're now the Bush-Obama tax cuts, of course, which is right. That's a problem. But you don't have any professional institution. You don't have any communication system to talk against the war machine. You just have the peace movement. Well, nobody funds it. I can tell you, as someone who's worked in the peace movement for many years, nobody funds it. If I had a dime for everybody who's emailed me complaining about all the money I get from George Soros, I'd be rich. I could actually talk to George Soros someday, you know. But nobody does. And there's no corporate media in the United States that isn't complicit, that isn't making money off the war machine. And that goes for Rupert Murdoch, too. I mean, this is a major crime boss being threatened with parking tickets here. This is a guy who openly confesses to having pushed these wars. That's criminal.
Okay, let's talk about the media war machine, because when this war in Libya first broke out, the mainstream media characterized these rebels, I think it's fair to say that many characterized them as the heroes of democracy, championing democracy. Now, recently, we've seen a few mainstream articles, stories coming out, the New York Times, CNN, saying that, hey, maybe these rebels aren't such nice people. Did reporters, did the media not know that maybe they weren't such nice people 3 months ago?
I don't think they knew, and I don't think they cared or asked for the most part.
So why do they care now, do you think?
Can
you speculate for me?
Well, perhaps because it's been going for months and it was supposed to be over in days. Why bother caring about something that's going to be over in days, not weeks? Perhaps because there actually is resistance in Congress, at least a much greater pretense of resistance than we've seen on Iraq or Afghanistan in these several years. And a large part of that is Republicans who just hate Obama more than they hate peace or justice. But it's significant. It's a sign of life out of Congress. And maybe that gives corporate reporters the room to operate and to begin to question.
That's an interesting take. I want to talk a little bit about the reason why NATO went in and the reason why the U.S. went in and the humanitarian mission and where that stands now. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was here in the RT studios and he was doing an interview for Voice of Russia, the radio station. And this is what he said about the toll of the airstrikes on civilians. I want to play that.
The airstrikes themselves go well beyond military targets. Some residential quotas have been hit. And it's a cause of concern because the main goal of the resolution is not to hit the targets with the risk for the civilian population. It's exactly the protection of the civilians. And the civilians are suffering both from Gaddafi forces and from the forces of the coalition.
So he's saying that civilians are suffering because of the coalition. It's something that I've had many people on my show speaking about as well, and talking about money to connect the money and the war efforts as, we've been trying to do. This has cost like $368 million. That could fund a lot of more productive humanitarian efforts. You could argue, an example, for the price of the Tomahawk missiles we've fired, the U.S. could have purchased 52 million mosquito nets to prevent malaria, which kills 1 million people every year. What do you think is, as far as the humanitarian explanation for this at all anymore? I know you never really believed that, but now that so much money is being spent, what do you think needs to be done about that?
It's not clear the American public ever believed it. The American public has turned against this faster than any previous war, which is much to its credit. The problem is we don't control our government in Washington. Not only has Congress never appropriated a dime for war in Libya and never authorized it and passed resolutions declaring that it's unauthorized but allowing it to continue, but they voted down in this biggest ever military budget. They voted down an amendment from Congresswoman Barbara Lee that said, get rid of that $5 billion slush fund that lets presidents do these things without asking us. They voted that down. They said, leave that in place in case a president wants to do this sort of thing again. That's reckless and criminal, and that's what this president is counting on. There's nothing humanitarian about bombing people's homes. There is nothing to say that that isn't hostilities, as the president's legal advisors now argue. It's absolutely outrageous.
I want to keep this discussion going for just one more minute, if that's okay. But speaking of hostilities, how much money has to be spent for this to be considered hostilities? Because we've seen that Congress has asked to move $5 billion in funds to, a lot of it, account for the hundreds of millions of dollars that are needed to replace bombs that are dropped in Libya. How much needs to be spent in order for these to qualify as hostilities for the Obama administration?
For the Obama administration, whatever they name, I mean, there's no logic to it, and they're not following any laws or any precedent. When the War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973, it explicitly, clearly intended to cover all military operations. So my answer is a single cent. And that has been spent, and as you know, much more than that has been spent. It's wars and hostilities. This is hostilities. Dropping bombs on people's homes is hostilities. It doesn't matter whether the Americans are there on the ground or the Americans are back at their desks launching the drones and then going home and committing suicide. It's hostilities. A single cent.
All right. Well, a lot more has been spent than a single cent. Thank you for helping us make sense of this. That was campaigner for Roots Action, David Swanson.